right, everybody, welcome back to another great episode of the Red, White, News Show with your host, the Military Medium, and a shout out to our special sponsors making this episode possible, Trailblazing Communication, tools taking back your life. So with us today, I have Duane France. He is a mental health, a clinical mental health counselor. I want to make sure I got that right. Currently serving as a director of Veterans Services at Family Care Center, a private mental health counseling agency specializing in unique needs of military service members, veterans, and their families. He's also the executive director of the Colorado Veterans Health and Wellness Agency, a 501(c) nonprofit affiliated with the Family Care Center. And of course, Duane is a retired Army non-commissioned officer, retired after 22 years, of course, a blogger, podcast host, and a 3-time author. Duane, welcome to the Red, White News Show.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Dean. I guess we don't need to do the show now. You got everything there.
And there we go. I got it all. So, we were chatting a little bit before we started the show and, just talking a little bit about kind of your background. But, and I know that's kind of the canned, bio, but, if you would share a little bit, maybe in your words, who Duane is and a little bit of your background, kind of where everything started for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I retired, as you said, it was 22 years in 2014. Spent all of my career in logistics. I made the choice at MEPS to, which job gets me out of here the quickest, and that was happened to be one of them. Spent 2 tours overseas in Germany. I was in the 82nd way back in the last decade, let's say, and then 5 combat and operational deployments, Bosnia, 1 Iraq, 2 Afghanistans. And then I finished my career out with the 10th Special Forces Group, went to North Africa with them, and then sort of rode the parachute off into the sunset.
Nice. Certainly very diverse, and first and foremost, obviously, thank you for your service. Thanks what you're continuing to do for our veterans and our communities out there. But I want to dive in a little bit. How the heck do you go from military to being a mental health counselor?
Well, it's a little bit of a natural extension, right? It's what the platoon sergeant does. It's what the first sergeant does, right? Maybe in a different way, but,
Sure.
Hey, Joe, what's going on? That kind of thing. Not in that little quick snapshot, but I spent 3 years as a recruiter right there at the beginning. I left Germany and I wanted to go to Campbell. I knew we were going to deploy, and the Army in its infinite wisdom says, if you want to volunteer for something, here's recruiting duty. So I got interested in sort of the, psychology and mindset there. I had some good mentors there. Probably this was definitely when I was in Iraq and thinking about, what am I going to be when I grew up? I always thought that I was going to be one of these junior ROTC instructors, maybe a history professor or something. One of those guys that, students could derail asking about war stories and not get any homework like I did with my Vietnam veteran teachers. I sort of thought that's always what I wanted to do. That aspect of teaching and mentoring was definitely one of the things that I valued when I was in the Army. But coming back from Iraq, this is probably December of 17, and our unit was going through the reintegration process. The whole thing about, don't kick the dog, don't yell at the neighbors, that kind of stuff. And one of the presenters there was a retired Air Force major, and she was a licensed clinical social worker. Just randomly out of the blue, she stopped the middle of her talk, and there were probably about 120 of us in the room there. And she said, if any of you are interested in psychology, consider a career in the mental health field, because there are not enough combat veterans to serve all of the veterans that we need to serve in the mental health field. So it was sort of that stone kind of dropped into my mind. About the same time, came back. And so I've been here. My family has been here at Carson since 2006. Of course, I did the Grand World Tour. Fort Carson has one of the first veterans courts in the nation. They started in 2008 or 2009. So about that same time where I was going through my mental health piece, and I saw these veterans that would come back, obviously the reasons for misbehavior in 2008 were a lot different than the ones in 98. And so I thought, those veterans are really going to need somebody that understands their background, understands their experience. And sort of those two things came together and started on the path. Did a lot of my schooling while I was still in active duty. I do not recommend taking a 400 level neuropsychology course while leading patrols in Afghanistan. I'd do that over again if I could. But yeah, so I retired in 14 and I got my master's degree in 2015. I've been working with veterans as a therapist ever since.
Wow. That's certainly like you talked about, that's certainly a caseload, of not only being overseas, but taking on that much schooling over there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, the guys would go play Call of Duty and I'd knock out a 12-page paper on, neuropsychology and the patterns of the brain and stuff like that. So, we all have our coping.
Sure. So, one of the things going into it kind of opens a doorway, right? In the mental health counseling world, did you find, in a sense, because we all struggle in our own challenges or our own journeys, but did you find in that, in your journey with learning about behaviors and different triggers and different things, did you find a sense of healing maybe for your own self, or maybe some of the challenges that you were facing personally?
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is one of the things is, my shield covers my brother and my brother's shield covers mine kind of thing. Right. And so in healing others, one, we must be healed, and we must make sure we're healed before we do that. Dipping a little farther back, so my old man was a Vietnam veteran. One of a number of different things that sort of started me down this path. But I was in Germany. This had to be probably around 2001 when I got a phone call from my sister and say that, my father, she thought that he was suicidal. She thought that he was going to take his own life. And so the first suicide intervention I ever conducted was from, thousands of miles away on the other side of the world, with my Vietnam veteran father. So I'd seen it, right? I'd
Wow.
seen what kind of thing happened. My father and three of his brothers were all in Vietnam, and they all reacted differently. So I grew
Sure.
up seeing what combat does, not just to individuals but families, obviously. And so, having gone through that in Iraq and in Afghanistan, 2009, 2010, I saw firsthand what was going to be happening, right? So I grew up seeing what these guys were going to experience the next
Right.
15 years,
Right.
and experiencing it myself. Came back from Afghanistan, took over a company, and I was 100% honest with my troops. Is my wife and I went to marriage counseling after Iraq and again after Afghanistan. I said, hey, First Sergeant's not going to be here this afternoon because he's going to see the therapist. He's going to marriage counseling. Being open like that.
Sure. Sure.
But then there's Carl Jung, who is one of the leading individuals in the early psychiatry and psychology.
Mhm.
Jung has these different archetypes, and one of the archetypes is the wounded healer. And as he was developing this, as he was looking, and this was when he was in Vienna, he was looking to the emerging field of psychiatry in Austria, and saw that there were some psychiatrists that were very good at treating certain things, and these were things that they had overcome themselves.
Right.
So it's this idea of the best healers, sort of like the best preacher's a former sinner, right? So the wounded healers were the ones that were able to best treat those wounds that they had overcome. But then the other piece, the other thing that he saw, the ones that were the worst wounded healers were ones that hadn't healed from those wounds that they were trying to help others. So
Right.
it's really kind of a fine line. But yes, absolutely. Understanding more about the brain or the military brain helps me understand more about my brain.
Right. Well, it's interesting you bring up the archetypes, and the people that are basically trying to help others heal, but they haven't healed themselves. And, but in a sense, there's, a healing in healing, helping others heal, find their way out. So, it's interesting because, um, in an aspect of, hey, I've been down a similar path. I've experienced some of these similar emotions, and so you can be empathetic with that individual and kind of understand what's going on at a deeper level. So it's interesting you bring up young. Um, so how did going into your books a little bit, over the years, you've, come to birth out 3 books. And how did these come about? Was it just a normal progression for you? Was it like, hey, there's more in me to share, and what I want to help educate and try to change the narrative out there? Because even though I get it, the military would say, hey, we want to promote it's strong to go ask for help and everything else, but the subculture is still there. It's still, hey, you're a weak ass, you're on profile, you're broke, right? Those are words that still, and whether it's said out loud or just thought in the soldier's mind because of the subculture, the narrative, um, because they want to be a warrior, quote unquote warrior mentality. I can't be broke and be a warrior. I can't, I gotta be, was it the masculine, was it the Spartan mentality, right? um what was the progression with the books?
So it's a great question, and yes, that is out there, and that is a lot of it is to help people understand. I found that a lot of what I was talking to my clients about was resonating. And you'd mentioned the blog, and so I'd started writing. I had a colleague of mine who recommended, and I would talk to her about this stuff, and she wasn't a veteran, right?
Mhm.
She is somebody who, just has a clinical practice here in Colorado, and she said, more people need to hear about what you're talking about. And so I started writing, writing a weekly blog, and then probably after about a year of that. So as I'd mentioned, to kind of go back, we started working with the Veterans Court. I actually ended up, when I saw myself in 2009 thinking I was going to work with Veterans Courts, I ended up actually being a therapist for the Veteran Court. And Here in El Paso County, Fort Carson, Colorado, and Peterson Air Force Base, new home of the Space Command. I'm waiting for Starfleet Academy to be up on top of one of these mountains here somewhere. But huge military. It's the only county with 5 military installations within its
Wow.
geographic boundaries in
Right.
the U.S. Right, so significant military population. And Along with that, we have a rise in a number of justice involved veterans. So, our local county jail here in El Paso County, on any given day, there's about 150 to 200 incarcerated veterans waiting trial or serving short sentences and things like that. And for a wide range of things, obviously for reasons that they're there. But also, Josephine goes downtown, gets drunk, and ends up in the back of a cop car for a number of different reasons.
Right.
And so we actually have what's called a veterans ward. So an entire cell block of just veterans.
Oh, wow.
There's about 70, I think 70, 75 of these veterans. And as I was going through my time as a therapist for the Veterans Court, a number of these veterans came in and said, hey, for the first time, you're breathing different air, right? You're inside, you're incarcerated. They're like, we're not drunk, we're not high. We're kind of realizing that we need to do something different. So they wanted to start a peer support group, and they said, hey, do you have anything that we can read? Do you have any, sort of like how AA has the blue book or something like that, right?
Sure.
And they said, do you have anything that you can give us that we can sort of read an article and then talk about it? And I was like, well, happens that I kind of do. So that's what the first book came about, was putting together 52 of these articles. And in the book, they're short 1 or 2 page kind of things that these veterans, these incarcerated veterans, would read, and then they talk about a wide different range of topics, things like moral injury, things like purpose and meaning after the military. And so after that, once you do 1 book, you got to do 2. And once you do 2, you might as well do 3. And so that's really what these are. These are compilations of the
Sure.
blogs that developed into something that people can use.
What was the order of the books? Was Combat Vet Don't Mean Crazy? Was that the first?
So this is where, we talk about origin stories. The actual first one was the second one published, but Headspace and Timing, that was actually the first 52
Okay.
book series. I released it in an ebook. A lot of people were like, hey, can I get it in paperback? So it's like Beatles albums, right? Which one came in Britain? Which of the first came in? So really the first book that I wrote was Headspace and Timing. Then it was Combat Vet Don't Mean
Cool.
Crazy. And then Military in the Rearview Mirror, I just released this past December.
So let's focus on the first one really quick, because I love when your page and the book and everything came across my feed somehow on social media. I was like, God, I love the title, Headspace and Timing, right? And I know we were chatting about just about everybody that has ever dealt with weapons in the military knows what a 50 cal is.
Yeah.
And if you dealt with a 50 cal, you know what a headspace and timing gauge is.
At least we did, right? Now they don't need,
right.
Maybe 10 years from now,
right. Yeah, maybe.
We can talk
right.
about
but explain to maybe the listeners that don't know what a headspace timing gauge is, but more importantly, how did you come about with that title? Because I feel that it's so apt, it speaks to me on deeper levels, but, speak from your perspective on it and how you came to be.
Yeah. So number one, it is a universal weapon, right? All the branches of the military, I don't want to say even the Air Force, but even the Air Force, right? But on their AC-130 gunships, they have 50 cals. Tail gunners have 50 cals. Navy, so it is a familiar weapon across all the different branches, right? So it's not something that my favorite weapon of choice when I was deployed was the Mark 19. I love the destructive power, but it was so finicky, right? You get a little bit of dust in it and it doesn't work.
Right.
The 50 cal was a very durable weapon. It is a very durable weapon. You could drop it in the mud, you can kick it around, and you can pick it up and it can still fire, right? And that's the same thing with veterans, right? We are very durable. We're very versatile. We can fit in a lot of different areas. But the thing with the 50 cal was if the headspace and timing wasn't set correctly, it didn't operate. And it was just a huge useless chunk of metal. And the headspace and timing gauge is a little piece of metal that's about the size of my thumb, right? And so you have this huge, powerful, resilient weapon, if we want to use that word, that can be rendered inoperable if this small thing isn't set correctly. And that's the same thing with us, is we can be rendered inoperable if our headspace, if our mind, if our outlook, if our behavioral health and mental health and psychological and emotional health, spiritual health, if these things aren't set correctly, then we're not going to be effective either. And so that's really where it kind of came about. That was an old Sergeant Major friend of mine. He and I had started to develop that and kind of bounced it around. To be honest, it was the first thing that kind of popped into my head, and it was really appropriate. That's what I talked to a lot of my clients about is, what we're trying to do is get your headspace and timing set right in your mind so that you can be effective in your life after the military.
Nice. I just love the analogy between that. And, like I said, as soon as I heard it, it was something that spoke to me, obviously knowing the analogy firsthand, but, and I think the 50 caliber is a weapon that is, I think you just hit the nail right on the head. And, the interesting thing too is, the 50 cal is still a weapon that you can, the military anyways, they're still pulling 50 cals out of the crate, packed in cosmoline, back from the 40s, brand new from the still in, it still hasn't been, in service. So I find it interesting that, as you put it, the resiliency of the weapon platform. And again, I just think it's beautiful. The analogy of that little piece of metal, the headspace timing gauge, can render absolutely that weapon inoperable. So yeah, beautiful. So you were saying that the 3 books are compilations that basically of the blog, correct? And so share with us a little bit about that. If we could go a little bit deeper into it. I know that, but with the books, but I know one that I'm looking at is Military in the Rearview Mirror. And of course, all of them talking about the mental health aspect, but what is more about the military in the rearview mirror? Obviously, the title is suggesting transitioning from the military.
Yeah, this is one of the things is, once you're inside the machine, you can't conceive of life outside the machine,
Right,
right? And so
right,
when I was here active duty in Fort Carson, off post was some place that, I went to go sleep. Maybe I went to the movies and stuff. But when we're in the military, everything is facing inwards. You can't think about life after the military when you're in the military. And then, I got out of this military and there's this entire world opening up, right?
right,
And for me, especially where I went into for about 18 months before I got my degree, I worked with homeless veterans. So I was seeing the almost I don't want to say inevitable, but some of the consequences of veteran service members not taking care of themselves or getting themselves into situations afterwards. And so the concept of military in the rearview mirror is that when we leave the military, we have a choice of sort of going through this tunnel, right? And this tunnel
right,
is however long it is. Some veterans will sit down at the beginning of that tunnel, face back towards the military, and they're stuck there. That's all they want to do. They wish they were back in the military. Their entire identity is around the military. Then you have some of them that are struggling through this tunnel, wandering around lost, not sure what they want to do, kind of stumbling through the dark. And then finally, getting through that tunnel, who I am after the military, what is my post-military identity? Then there's some folks like me, perhaps like you, who had gotten outside the other side of that tunnel and decided to go back in that tunnel and kind of help those veterans struggling to navigate. And so, military in the rearview mirror is really looking at how our experience shaped us. So, looking at the past, how what happened in the past is shaping who we are right now. It's looking at what we're doing right now to sort of get through that transitional, and then the idea of what am I going to become? What does the future look like? And so
right.
the last two books are really arranged in the kind of themes, and that's really what military in the rearview mirror is how do I understand and deal with what happened to me to make me who I am, accept who I am, and then create a better me for the future, let's say.
Nice, nice. So I would like to, if we could, for a moment, talk about we talked about it briefly, but I would like to talk about it a little bit more in depth about changing the narrative, right? We talked about the, perception that if a service member or a veteran goes and seeks help for mental health, trauma, whatever, right? That they're perceived as weak. And again, trying to change the narrative or change the subculture that's out there. And I know some of that, what you do really at its basis is trying to change that narrative. But, obviously you work in this day in, day out. Um, can you speak to that a little bit more? And also, if you could, have you seen, at least in your slice of the pie, so to speak, that have you seen that narrative changing?
And I think we really can and should take a very long view at this because, again, when they're in the middle of the machine, we're not seeing them outside the machine. When you're in the middle of change, it's very hard to see the change. But if I think back to 2006, 2007, one of the 15-month tours in Iraq, we didn't have embedded behavioral health, right? We didn't
Right.
have, and yes, as soon as somebody, let's say, went off the deep end or whatever, they were whisked away and they were, somewhere else. Whereas if you fast forward, my next deployment was 2008, 2009. We actually had we had a psychologist embedded in our unit. We used to take her on patrol with us, right? She would go around. So I think that this concept that the Army did in around 2007, 2008 of embedding behavioral health
Mm,
individuals into units started to make it more acceptable, more so. As a matter of fact, I used to say, I tell my guys, don't go to the psychiatrist because all they're going to do is dope you up, and I need to take you on patrol. Go
Right.
see doc, right? Doc will take care of you. And so it's this idea is, we've sort of always had the chaplain, and the chaplain was sort of that de facto safe place to go to talk about stuff. And so now, and as I saw between, again, the early parts of OIF, OEF, and then when I retired in 2014, it did become easier. Some of the thing is, and as you mentioned, we really got to get things down to the first line leader level to really get the culture to change, right? So the old man can stand up in front of formation all day long and say, I go to therapy. You can go, well, you're the colonel, right? Nobody's going to bust on you for going to therapy. But,
Right.
here at Fort Carson, and everybody has the post-deployment processing, but we have this huge long hallway where everybody's sitting there in their line waiting for the provider. And it's a huge wasted day. If the sergeant major is walking up and down the hall and saying, hey, make sure you talk to somebody about getting help, make sure you talk to somebody about getting help. Well, that E3 is sitting next to that E5 that they just spent 12 months with. And that E5 is telling that E3, you better not say nothing. You better not. If you say something, they're going to give you a purple folder. They're going to take you to another building. You're going to lose your leave, right? And so it's not so much the message that we need to get at the top level. It's we need to get down to that bottom level, right? Because by the time 2008 came around, the E7s had already been trained by the E6s in their second deployment and their E5s in their first deployment. And so it's really sort of this generational shift that needs to happen. And so that's inside the military, and everything that's happening in the veteran community started in the Department of Defense, right? And so I think, yes, there is a shift. I'm starting to see this shift. Obviously, people are aware of the veteran suicide epidemic. But over the last 3 or 4 years, a lot of people have been more comfortable acknowledging the fact that there's nothing wrong with seeking mental health help any more than there is about physical health help.
Right, right. Well, that's interesting. And I remember early days of deployment, it went from no post-deployment survey to a one pager. And then all of a sudden, then you got like 3, or I want to say some X amount of hours, right? So there's briefings, and I mean, days upon days of realizing, saying, ooh, we got an issue. And so
Yeah,
we're
yeah, and also the Army does to any kind of training, but especially mental health training, what they do to eggs and potatoes, right? They just boil the crap out of it until
right.
it's kind of tasteless, right? So
Jason.
it
Yeah.
really needs to be, we've been through that. This is one thing that I, as a
Right.
mental health professional, I have a colleague who I do a podcast with, and she says we as mental health professionals have to understand that service members have a different relationship with mental health professionals. When we were in the Army, the mental health professional, the psych doc, they're there to either approve us for something or take something away. They're there to evaluate us, right? They're
Right.
not always there to make sure we're feeling okay. And so a lot of service members have sort of an adversarial relationship. We've been tested 6 ways to Sunday. We know exactly how to answer those, have you had any nightmares? Have you any thoughts of self-harm? How many drinks do you have? Uh, you know, 3 drinks 3 nights a week. I'm good, but, and so it's one of those things where the mental health profession has to change while the mindset of the service member has, and it has to, and it has to change, but it's also difficult when you're in the military. But then we carry that I don't need to change mentality out of the military when we probably have some time to do so.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. And I know you talk about the mental health piece, and I remember, and of course this was with the National Guard, and I think it's pretty much copacetic through at least the Army, but they're even doing testing now for TBIs
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
mental clarity and cognitive brain capacity, and timed questionnaires and different things, so make sure that you're keying in on different things. Very interesting. We've really come as not only as and of course we're not just focusing on the Army. Of course, that's our background, you and I, but talking about all the branches as a collective group. Um, Now, I got a question, and because you made a slight joke about it, because obviously Colorado is home to Space Force, the newest sixth branch of the military, and of course, probably the brunt of the joke, even the Coast Guard is joking on them, right? But interesting enough is, are you starting to work with this? Has there been any reach out to saying, hey, obviously they're going to be plugging in at where everybody else is because that's what the Department of Defense, but have you started, have you or anybody else started connections to anybody in that branch?
So I mean, I have some personal connections, right?
Sure,
There's a
sure,
lot of friends and some colleagues that are doing that. But this is one of the things that a lot of people, again, looking in from the outside, it's all this brand new. I was
sure.
working with Army Space Command back in 2013, right?
Right,
This
right.
is
Yep.
so in the last several years, I was a company operations NCO for the support element for 10th Special Forces Group, but I was also an applied suicide intervention skills instructor.
Sure.
So assist as a kind of gatekeeper training.
Yep.
And one of my colleagues and I, she was with the Army Space Command, and she and I conducted some suicide intervention training for Army Space Command. The Air Force has been in space, since space has been space,
Right,
right? So,
right, right.
so I think that it's really just more of a delineating the yards that have sort of
Right.
always been there. I think that obviously it's valid, and we're not going to get into spacecraft. I mean, a lot of it is
Yep.
things like satellites and satellite defense and GPS. But in Colorado, space has always been here. A lot of the defense contractors have been here, so it's pretty much just you know leave the Air Force uniform on Friday and pick up the Space Force uniform on Monday.
Sure, sure. Pretty much just a change of one name tag or whatever, as far as
Right.
right. Interesting, and but do you so and I know you were sharing that, as far as, hey, it's really nothing new. It's just kind of like I don't want to say a fresh coat of paint on an old vehicle, right? Like taking a Humvee and painting it blue, saying, oh, now it's a Space Force Humvee, right? uh but it's the same vehicle in a sense. um and I guess part of me is thinking, with the incursion or introduction of a new branch, obviously the logical side and the analytical side says there is a lot of new things that will be introduced. And my question being is that I'm wondering if this will also introduce new opportunities, new avenues of mental health, advocacy and help, as they go forward and with this new branch, and then also kind of leaching out in different ways to other branches. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think that yes, there's always lessons learned, right? I mean,
Sure.
if we think about this in our lifetime, this hasn't happened, but the Air Force emerged out of the Army Air Corps, right?
Right.
And the Marine Corps, a separate branch, is a sub department of the Department of the Navy, right? So, I think that a lot of people are looking at this as something similar. The Space Force being to the Air Force what the Marines are to the Navy. And that kind of thing. But things like the Department of Defense Office of Suicide Prevention is really managing suicide prevention efforts across all branches, understanding that there are different cultures, there are different subcultures within each branch, and then there are cultures across branches that are different. So, for example, the culture in the Marine Corps obviously is different, although similar, to culture in the Army, right? And so talking to a Lance Corporal may be different than talking to a PFC,
Right.
but talking to a Green Beret is very different than talking to somebody who's conventional forces, where you might have some similarities between a Green Beret and a Navy SEAL, right? So there are these cultures and subcultures, everything that defines a culture, whether it's way of speaking, way of dressing, our own language, right? I speak both acronym and expletive fluently, right? And so all of these things that can define a culture. We are a culture. The military is a separate culture. I describe it as if I went to go live in Ireland for 22 years. Yeah, we speak English, but it's a totally different culture. Now I have to come back and live in Colorado and reintegrate into a culture that's not familiar with me, the same way that the environment I'm trying to reintegrate is not familiar with my culture. And so I think that there is that, but it's really in the form of getting some lessons learned on things that have worked with other branches in the past. As far as I understand, with the exception of the class of cadets that just graduated from the Air Force Academy that commissioned to the Space Force,
Right.
most of them are all career Air Force officers and senior NCOs and things like that anyway.
Right. Switching gears a little bit. If somebody was sitting out there right now listening to this or watching this, what would be 5 tips? If you could give just 5 tips of maybe somebody to help with their mental health. And I know there's so many more. I know how can you boil it down to 5, but if you could just do 5, 5 or so tips on how to help with your mental health, or maybe even increase your resilience. What would those be?
So, what is that old Rodney Dangerfield movie? I've got 5 questions and 37 parts, right? Let's see.
Right.
So back to school, that's what it was. So first, it's not all about PTSD and TBI. That's what even service members think, that it's PTSD, that everything is PTSD. Now, PTSD is a separate diagnosable condition that meets certain criteria, right? And so not all illness is cancer, and not all psychological disturbance is PTSD. So that's one of the biggest things that I try to tell people is, if there's a slice or if there's a pie, it's not 2 slices, it's not just PTSD and TBI. So understanding that there are other things going on. The other thing you mentioned is resilience. Is we have a medical model of military mental health. And the medical model is there is an illness that needs to be treated, that there is a diagnosis that needs to be conducted, and then we need to, write a prescription, whether it's a therapy or whether it's medication, to fix that. And that's where traumatic brain injury, a physical injury to the brain, that is a medical model. PTSD, substance use is a diagnosable condition, and then depression and anxiety and things like that. So that's the medical model, but there's other things that go along with service members. A colleague of mine, Megan Mobbs, she's out of Columbia University, and she talks about transition stress. And so transition stress is something separate than the regular, quote unquote, what we know of. And this is things like moral injury, purpose and meaning. How do we meet our needs, and then how are our relationships? So that's the other thing, is recognizing that for military service members, there's more than just PTSD and TBI, that there are these other things we have to pay attention to.
Boy, each one of those things you could sit and talk for hours about. I mean,
well,
it just opens this doorway upon doorway in that, right? The 5 things with 37 parts, right?
But I actually did do a 12 episode series on each of these subjects. So there's like 14 hours out there, an hour on each of these different areas.
Now, is this on your podcast?
Yeah, so that's on the Headspace and Timing podcast.
Okay.
There is a series that was published about the end of 2017.
Perfect.
That talks about each of these areas. And I bring on guests that have special expertise in each of these areas. So going off of that, one of the things that I always try to get people to understand is, for service members, we need to find something after the military that fills the hole that the military left. And that's purpose and meaning. We have to find some type of purpose and meaning in our post-military life. You asked earlier about whether or not this is healing for me. This is healing for me because it fills me with meaning, right? It satisfies me. It gives me something to do. And so, I always say that the military leaves this big hole in our lives, and we have to find something to fill that hole, or else it's going to get filled for us by, bad relationships and substance use and sitting around, not doing much of anything. So third thing is find purpose and meaning after life in the military. The other thing that I've come to observe is, if we may be doing better or worse in all of these areas, but if we don't have a control on our substance use and we don't have our relationships in place, in stable relationships, then it makes PTSD and depression and TBI and purpose, it makes it harder for all of that stuff to kind of be managed. Conversely, if we're not engaging in substance use and we do have stable relationships, I don't want to say substance use, but substance abuse. I mean, yeah, have a beer on the weekend.
Sure, sure,
I'm in Colorado. I don't engage in Colorado stuff, but a lot of guys engage in Colorado stuff.
sure.
That's fine.
Yeah,
But it's not so much that you do it, it's why you do. And if you're sitting there in the basement drinking beer night after night in the dark by yourself, not good, right? So if we have our substance use under control and we have stable relationships, that makes the other things able to be managed, right? So I think that's on number 4. And then number 5, really to talk about suicide, right? In the suicide epidemic, currently, and I'd mentioned as we started talking, the Headspace and Timing podcast is on hiatus. And I'm currently producing a year-long podcast called Seeking the Military Suicide Solution. So this is in partnership with Military Times. And we're looking at suicide in the military-affiliated populations, veterans, obviously DOD, their spouses, veteran spouses, children. So really looking at suicide. And suicide is a very complicated issue. And we need to take a public health approach to suicide because it's a public health problem, just like, drunk driving is a public health issue, obesity, all of these things. And so there are ways to address public health issues. And that's what we need to start thinking about suicide. A lot of people think about suicide like, what are the signs? Just tell me the signs so that I can witness the signs in someone else and I can keep them from taking their own life. Well, that's intervention, right? I'm trying to stop somebody from taking their own life in the next 24 to 48 hours. We really need to get into prevention. How do we keep people from getting into a suicidal crisis? So I'd say that's the 5th one, is we really need to look at suicide prevention in a different way.
is that more that year-long discussion or that podcast, is that more from a clinical aspect, or is that really taking different points of view from everybody? I know you mentioned even spouses of military members and, everybody from different walks of life, maybe even some children. And, is that more clinical, or is this taking from first person perspective and having an in-depth conversation about that, how it, from their view?
And that's a great question, Dean. And I think even your question illustrates some of the challenges that we're having, that it's not an either or.
Right.
It's a both
right.
and.
Right. Yeah.
And so myself and my co-host, we're both clinicians. So we do have the clinical experience, but we are also bringing on individuals that have lived experience. People from the Independence Fund, Sarah Verardo, she is a caregiver. She's a military spouse. And so it is about people with lived experience. We just had a guest on who is a first sergeant in the Air Force Reserves, about how she conducted some different, how she felt about some different suicide interventions in personal. And so we know what works, quote unquote. There are things that work at the national level. Evidence, research shows that these things work. How do we then take what works and apply it at the local level, knowing that it's going to be unique at the local level? But this is really how the podcast came about. Was, okay, we have all this awareness. How do we actually apply this? What actionable steps can we take to change the narrative about suicide in our communities?
Right. Well, hats off to you guys for tackling on that project, because obviously, as well as I do, that animal is bigger than that it looks. It's like, boy, it's a big issue, but it's when you get in there, it gets mired upon, like you just brought up. Is it just from one perspective? Is it from both? There's so many angles and different nuances and levels. It's absolutely crazy. And I know even on this show, is we've had people on talking, anything around military, it's going to bring up the aspect about trauma. And it's not just, obviously, it's not just a military issue. But talking about suicide and all that. And going back about 10 years, I know on the Army side, and you probably remember this, is when they kicked out the Suicide Stand Down Initiative. And it was usually around October. And I remember because it was right before I retired. And it was like, you guys will do 8 hours. And it was like, how do we, it was like, oh my God. And it was 8 hours of death by PowerPoint. But
Right.
right before because I was old and grumpy, I decided that we would keep PowerPoint to a minimum. And since I had the privilege of an ability, since obviously we're National Guard, to reach out to local community leaders and people, people that are in your position, to say, let's bring them on to speak to what, people that are in the local. But the reason that I want to share that is because immediately my mind went, oh my God, 8 hours of death by PowerPoint. That is, number one, going to suck ass. Everybody is going to tune out the first 20 minutes or 5 minutes, and it's just like, whatever, and be on their phones or whatever. Right. And so the thing is, or just check the block, and, it would just miss the narrative. So I think whether it's training or talking about how people can go about getting the help that they need, I think is tremendous. So hats off to you and everybody that you're partnering with. I think that's really cool. And now, is that new podcast, is that already out there as well?
It is, yeah. So we're approaching about halfway. So this is
Nice.
strictly going to be contained in 2020. So I think we've released 17 episodes so far.
Wow.
And there's going to be 50 episodes released within 2020.
Okay.
And then it's going to be exactly that, so the show's as a podcast host yourself, of course, the attention span of people. I mean, each of the show was about 30, maybe 35 minutes long. Right. And, folks can listen to it, and podcasting is a very accessible medium.
Yep.
So you're going to get these 8 hours of listening to these people or whatever, but you're going to get it in your own way, in your own time.
Right.
And so in hopefully the project is allowing some emerging themes, which it is actually does have some emerging themes coming out of it. One is, don't be a jerk to each other, right? Just be cool to each other.
Right.
And it's really going to do a lot to keep that done. But also it's about suicide prevention is everybody's job, right? It's not just the job as me as a mental health professional. It's also the job for me as a father, or me as a friend, or you as a broadcaster. It's the barista's job, it's the mechanic's job, it's everyone's job, not to be the suicide interventionist, but to try to help people from getting into that kind of crisis. So yes, it's pretty, but it's also going back to that question you had about, is it changing? I think it's an example of the fact that Military Times came on board and said, we want to address this issue.
That's quite something. When I heard you say that, as far as them being a sponsor, I was like, wow, that's pretty significant.
Yeah. But it's also significant in that they say, we recognize that this is an issue that's gone on way too long, and we need to be able to do something about it. So it's more of these mainstream conversations happening. And so I think that overall it's going pretty well, and we're pretty excited about it.
Awesome. Duane, where can they go if they want to check out your website, more of you guys' awesome work, your podcasts, blogs, articles, all that? Where can they go?
Well, I'm a pretty big guy, both in real life and online, so it doesn't take that much. As long as you spell my name right, you can find me. But everything is pretty much there at veteranmentalhealth.com. So all one word, veteranmentalhealth.com. The books are there, the podcasts are there, the blog and stuff like that. And so pretty much that's the one place. And then you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook. I don't have a TikTok, so I don't know what to tell you there.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much. My guest today, Duane France. Thank you so much, Duane. Once again, thank you for your service and what you continue to do, not only for the veteran community, but just what you're doing to change the culture and the narrative.
Thank you. And thanks for having me on, Dean. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. All right. You take care.